With Android Studio installed, we're now ready to use it and go ahead and create a project. So just go to my Start menu, find Android Studio, click on that. You'll find it starts much faster this time than it did the first time. So here we are at our Welcome to Android Studio screen. And from here, we can do whatever we need to do. We're going to go ahead and create a new project. You can see you could open an existing project. You could even import a project that was created with Eclipse. All right, we're going to go here and just say New Project. And you'll find as the new project screen comes up that it's very much like what we saw when we were using Eclipse. So here we are in the new project screen. And again, you'll find this wizard is very much like what we did inside of Eclipse, but it's a little bit more streamlined. Right? So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to go ahead and give my application name. And I'll just call this my demo app Android Studio. And you'll notice that it goes ahead and creates the module name, just like it did before, and it creates a package name, just like it did inside of Eclipse. Defaults it to com.example, just like we would want to do in Eclipse. We're going to go ahead and change this to something that's real. Remember, it's our reverse domain name in most cases. All right, let's make it plural site. You notice that we can set our minimum required SDK, right, the target SDK. What we want to use is the compiler, the theme. We'll talk more about those later. Remember that one of the things we had to do before was there was a separate wizard screens for the custom launcher icon and for creating an activity. All those are on this main screen now. So again, just kind of takes a few steps from the wizard. So we'll go ahead and say next. We get here for our launcher icon wizard step, right? We can use an image like we did before in terms of importing one. Or we can use the clip art like we talked about before, where we can bring up a list of different existing images. Where we can go ahead and create text if we want to, right? Make this something like demo app. Right, we can go ahead and put it inside of a circle. Right, set all that stuff up, even in terms of the spacing around it so we can see more of it. Right, so just all the things we could do before, just we could do inside of Eclipse. Say next. In terms of the activity we want to use, we're going to use a blank activity for now. Next. And then our activity name and our layout. Right, our layout name, right, in terms of the resource file we would use. Gives us the different resource type, or excuse me, navigation type choices. Again, we'll talk much more about those later on. So with that, we're all set. We can go ahead and click Finish. So here we are inside of Android Studio with our project created. Off to the side here, you'll see this project. I'll click on that. All right, this opens up my Project Explorer. Expand that out. You'll see the different files inside of the project. Expand that out. Right. You notice that here's my application. Right, you see there's folders under there. Now, one thing you'll notice is that there's no concept of a workspace inside of here. Workspace was specifically an Eclipse thing. Here we're just working with projects, right? So it's much more like working with Visual Studio. You'll notice also that the directory structure here is a little bit different than it was in Eclipse. Part of the reason for that is that underneath the main project folder, there's the IDE area here. This is things that Android Studio uses to manage itself. There's some other files up here that it uses for that. Then you see inside of here, there's the one demo app, Android Studio, project folder named just like what we created our project to be. And there's one here called Gradle. Right? Gradle is a enterprise level build system effectively. So one of the big things that's added into Android Studio is the concept of the ability to manage very complex builds. So they break the very top level out into those three major areas. Those are related to Android Studio, those are related to your project, and then those are related to the enterprise build. Now in this course, we're going to really focus on this main area here in terms of just our main project. And you'll notice that if we look inside of here, there's an SRC folder. If I expand that, remember that when we looked in Eclipse, SRC was where all of our source code was, and then RES was where all of our resources were. Here inside of Android Studio, they're layering it a bit more. That underneath of SRC, there's a main folder, and then underneath of there, there's a Java and an RES folder. So this SRC represents basically all of the content we're creating in the sense of both our source code and our resources. Our source code goes underneath the Java folder. If I expand that, you see there that I've got my com.pluralsite.demo app Android Studio, and then there's my Java file inside of there. If I double click on that, that opens up my Java file. Then I've got my resources here. If I expand those, you see that this is the very same hierarchy we saw before when we were working with Eclipse, that we have our different resource types, right? We have things like our layout, and our layout is inside of there. This window popping up, this move, this is a bug apparently in this pre-build. Let me just go ahead and cancel that out. Right? I'm just trying to show that inside of the layout resource, We have the activity main layout. We're going to double click on that. See, this gives us our GUI for actually building the UI, so we can drag and drop different controls on here, right? Very much like we saw in Eclipse, but we'll find that in Android Studio it's even richer. We're going to head back to my project view. Right, so we have also inside of here, if I scroll down just a little bit, we'll see that I've got my Android manifest. Now, if I double click on that, notice that takes me into the manifest file. Now, one thing that we don't have in Android Studio that we did have in Eclipse is we don't have a GUI that sits over top of the manifest. Right? Remember that in Eclipse, there was that kind of GUI layer that just presented a bunch of forms we could type into that built the manifest. Android Studio does not currently have that. I don't know if it's going to or not. IntelliJ never did. But one thing you'll find is that as we work with the manifest inside of Android Studio, the XML prediction in terms of attributes and attribute values that you want to set is so good that honestly, in my opinion, it's just as good and in some ways even better than the GUI, because the predictability or the predictiveness of the environment is just so rich that way. If we look around our toolbar here, we'll find that all the things you would kind of expect to find. Right, if I go up here, I've got my SDK manager, right, so I can launch the SDK manager just like we did in Eclipse, right, to manage all of our versions of our tools and so forth. Notice we've got our AVD manager, right, click on that to go ahead and launch and manage our emulators. Here we've got our DDMS, right? Remember that inside of Eclipse, DDMS was another perspective. Where here, if we click on this, it'll just go ahead and launch DDMS as a standalone, right? If I click on that, we'll see that here we have a DDMS view that looks very much like it did inside of Eclipse. The only difference is in this case, it's a free-floating window instead of being inside of the editor environment. And then, of course, from here, we can do things like run our program, debug our program, right? All the things you would expect to see from inside of here. So you see that we've got all those same features we had inside of Eclipse, and it works very much like what we saw in Eclipse. But you'll find as we work with it, and if you were to compare the environments of what you can do in Eclipse and what you can do in Android Studio, I've long been of the opinion that you can be much, much more productive in Android Studio, even back when it was IntelliJ. And you'll see as we work through it that the ability to work in here, it's going to be much more like what you're used to in Visual Studio. Eclipse, although it had evolved a lot, had never really reached that productivity of Visual Studio. You'll see that Android Studio gets you much, much closer to that environment.